The Mafia boss found the Black Maid fixing a broken decoration and realized she repaired it for his mother. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Alexander Whitmore stepped into the east wing of the house just as the afternoon light slid across the polished floor, the quiet broken only by the faint tick of an old wall clock that had kept time in this mansion for decades. And that was when he saw her. Ruth Johnson stood near the mantel, small against the tall stone fireplace, holding a delicate ceramic decoration between her palms, the kind of object most people would never notice but that carried weight here, a piece no one had touched since his mother last placed it there years ago. The house had rules, spoken and unspoken, and one of them was clear to everyone who worked there. Nothing personal belonged to anyone but him, and certainly nothing that had once belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. Alexander stopped without meaning to, his footsteps silent on the rug as he watched from a few yards away, his expression unreadable, the instincts that had built his reputation sharpening in an instant. Ruth did not see him at first. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, her focus absolute, as if the rest of the world had faded away, and her fingers moved with careful patience, aligning a thin crack that ran through the decoration like a scar. She had brought no tools. Only a small cloth and a steady calm, the kind earned through years of quiet work, and there was something deliberate in the way she held the piece, as though she understood its fragility beyond its surface. Alexander's gaze followed the object to the faint line she was repairing, and memory pressed in, uninvited, the image of his mother at this same mantel, standing barely 5 feet tall, insisting that some things were worth fixing even when they could not be replaced. He had not thought of that moment in years. The house felt different then, warmer, less like a fortress and more like a home, and for a brief second, the distance between past and present narrowed to the width of that fragile ceramic edge. Ruth finally sensed a presence and froze. The decoration held midair, her breath catching as she turned and met Alexander's eyes. She did not speak. She did not drop the piece. She simply waited, prepared for whatever came next, knowing exactly what it meant to be seen here, touching something that was never hers to touch. Alexander said nothing either. The silence stretched, thick but controlled, and in that pause, the balance of the room shifted. He was used to rooms going still because of him, used to people explaining themselves too quickly or backing away, but Ruth did neither. She stood her ground quietly, not defiant, not careless, just present. And as he looked from her face back to the decoration in her hands, Alexander Whitmore felt the first stirrings of a realization that would change how he saw both the object and the woman holding it. Alexander Whitmore remained where he was, his presence filling the room without a single step forward, his eyes moving slowly from Ruth Johnson's face back to the object in her hands, then to the mantel where it had rested untouched for so long. In his world, silence was never empty. It was a test. And he was accustomed to watching people fail it. He expected apologies, hurried explanations, excuses layered over fear, but none came. Ruth stood still, her grip firm but gentle, as if the fragile decoration trusted her to hold it together just a moment longer. The air between them felt measured, controlled, and yet something subtle shifted beneath that control, something Alexander could not immediately name. He had built his life on precision, on knowing the weight of every decision and the cost of every mistake, and yet this moment refused to fall into any familiar pattern. His gaze lingered on the fine crack running along the ceramic surface, now barely visible, aligned so carefully that it seemed almost intentional, as if the piece had always been meant to be this way. He remembered his mother's voice, calm and unwavering, telling him that broken things told the truth about people, about whether they discarded what was damaged or took the time to understand it. Ruth lowered her eyes first, not in shame but in respect, her posture steady, waiting for instruction that did not come. She knew the rules as well as anyone else in the house. She knew what it meant to cross a line that had been left unspoken for years, and yet she had crossed it anyway, not out of carelessness, but because something deeper had compelled her forward. Alexander finally shifted his weight, the faint sound of leather against stone breaking the stillness, and Ruth's hands tightened just enough to keep the piece from trembling. He took a step closer, then another, stopping an arm's length away, close enough to see the fine lines in her palms and the careful way she avoided letting the repaired seam show. The house seemed to hold its breath with him. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the object. He simply observed, his attention sharp but not cruel, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the strange discomfort of uncertainty. This was his house, built with money, power, and years of hard decisions. Yet the quiet strength standing before him belonged to someone else entirely. Ruth had worked here for months without drawing notice, moving through hallways like a shadow, reliable, invisible, exactly as expected. Now she stood at the center of the room, not asking for permission, not demanding forgiveness, only existing in the truth of what she had done. Alexander noticed the faint scent of cleaning soap on her sleeves, the practical shoes planted firmly on the rug, the absence of fear in her eyes despite everything she stood to lose. He realized then that whatever punishment or command he had prepared no longer fit the moment. This was not an intrusion driven by curiosity or entitlement. This was something else, something quieter, and as he studied the repaired decoration once more, Alexander Whitmore felt the weight of memory press against him, heavier than any rule he had ever enforced, and he knew the question forming in his mind would change the direction of what came next. Time seemed to slow for Ruth Johnson as she stood there with the decoration still cradled in her hands, the weight of it far heavier than its few ounces of ceramic. She was aware of Alexander Whitmore's presence in a way that went beyond sight or sound, the kind of awareness that settled in the chest and tightened the breath, but she did not allow it to show. Years of surviving on quiet discipline had taught her that fear, when displayed, only invited misunderstanding. Inside, however, her thoughts moved quickly, not toward excuses, but toward memories she had not expected to surface. She remembered the first time she had seen the decoration weeks earlier, dusted but cracked, slightly out of alignment on the mantel, a small flaw in a house that otherwise demanded perfection. She had recognized it immediately, not because of its value, but because of the hands that must have shaped it. The curve, the uneven glaze near the base, the faint impression of a thumb pressed too firmly along the edge. These were marks Ruth had learned to see long ago while caring for other people's homes and, more importantly, other people's mothers. She had spent years assisting elderly women who took pride in the simplest things, women who poured love into objects meant for no one else's approval. And when she saw this piece, she had felt that same quiet devotion echo back at her. She had not planned to touch it that day. She had told herself to leave it alone, to respect the invisible boundary that surrounded anything personal in this house. But when she noticed the crack had widened just enough to threaten a full break, something inside her refused to walk away. Ruth knew the risk. She knew how quickly a job could disappear, how easily trust could be withdrawn, especially in a place where power moved without explanation. Still, she had taken the piece down with careful hands, measuring each movement as if the room itself were watching, her heart steady but resolute. Now, standing before the man who owned both the house and her livelihood, Ruth felt the full consequence of that choice settle over her. She did not regret it. Her fear was not of punishment, but of being misunderstood, of having an act meant to preserve something meaningful reduced to a violation of rules. She wondered if Alexander Whitmore could see what she saw, or if all he saw was a line crossed by someone he had never needed to notice before. The thought made her grip tighten slightly, her fingers aligning the repaired seam once more, ensuring it held. She thought of Eleanor Whitmore without knowing her well, of the way the older woman's presence still lingered in the corners of the house, in the arrangement of furniture, in the softness of certain spaces that no amount of wealth could replace. Ruth had never met her, yet she felt she understood her, and that understanding had guided her hands more surely than any instruction. As Alexander stepped closer, Ruth kept her posture calm, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, refusing to let the moment steal her dignity. She had done this for the right reason, and whatever came next, she would face it without lowering her eyes to the floor. In the stillness of that room, Ruth Johnson accepted the uncertainty of what followed, holding not just a repaired decoration, but a quiet truth she believed was worth the risk. Alexander Whitmore's attention drifted from Ruth's steady hands to the mantle itself, and with that shift came a memory he had not allowed himself to revisit in years. The room around him softened, not in reality but in recollection, and he could almost see his mother standing there as she once had, measuring the space with an artist's eye rather than an owner's authority. Eleanor Whitmore had never cared for symmetry the way designers did. She believed objects should live where they felt right, not where they looked impressive, and she had placed that decoration on the mantel herself one quiet afternoon when Alexander was still young enough to linger in doorways and watch without being noticed. He remembered her hands clearly now, smaller than his, always warm, smoothing the glaze as she turned the piece slightly to catch the light from the window. She had told him she made it during a winter when the house felt too large and too empty, when creating something with her own hands made the silence easier to bear. Alexander had dismissed it at the time as sentiment, something unnecessary in a world that rewarded strength, but his mother had smiled in that knowing way of hers and said that strength without care was just another kind of loneliness. After she was gone, the decoration became untouchable, not because of any spoken rule, but because no one wanted to be the one to acknowledge that something she made could break. When the crack first appeared, thin as a strand of hair, Alexander had noticed it in passing and then looked away, unwilling to face what it represented. Time had done what it always did, widening the damage slowly, quietly, until the flaw became impossible to ignore. He had chosen distance over repair, believing that leaving it as it was preserved something of her presence, even as the piece weakened day by day. Now, seeing it supported by Ruth's careful grip, he realized how flawed that belief had been. The decoration had never been meant to remain frozen in grief. His mother had made it to be held, to be used, to be cared for, and perhaps even to be mended when the time came. Alexander studied the repaired seam again, noticing how precisely it followed the original line, not hidden, not erased, but honored. It looked like something Eleanor would have approved of, a repair that did not pretend damage never happened, but refused to let it define the whole. The realization settled over him with unexpected weight, pressing against defenses he had built over decades. This object was not valuable because it was perfect or rare. It mattered because of the intention behind it, the quiet hours his mother spent shaping it, believing that small acts of creation could anchor a home. Ruth Johnson, standing there without fanfare or demand, had understood that instinctively. She had seen past ownership and rules and recognized the human story embedded in clay and glaze. Alexander felt something shift within him, a subtle recalibration of what he thought he knew about control and care. The house no longer felt like a monument to power in that moment, but like a space suspended between what had been lost and what could still be preserved. And at the center of that balance stood a woman who had repaired more than a cracked decoration without ever meaning to. Alexander Whitmore finally spoke, and when he did, his voice was calm, measured, stripped of the sharp edge most people associated with his name. He did not raise it, did not rush it, and the quiet authority in that restraint made the room feel even smaller. He asked Ruth what she was doing, not as an accusation, but as a statement that demanded honesty rather than fear. Ruth lifted her eyes to him then, meeting his gaze directly, and for a moment neither of them moved. She understood the weight of the question was not about the decoration alone, but about the choice she had made to act without permission. She answered simply, explaining that she noticed the crack growing wider over the past few weeks and believed that if it was left alone much longer, it would eventually split completely. Her voice was steady, respectful, and unembellished, as if she knew that adding emotion would only cheapen the truth. She told him she had repaired similar items before, things that mattered deeply to people who no longer had the strength to fix them themselves, and she believed this piece deserved the same care. Alexander listened without interrupting, his attention fixed on her face rather than the object, noting how her words carried no expectation of praise or leniency. When she finished, he asked why she did not report the damage to the house manager or leave it for someone else to handle. Ruth paused before answering, choosing her words with care, and said that sometimes when something is personal, passing it along feels like avoiding responsibility rather than respecting boundaries. She added that she did not think this was just decoration. and she did not want it treated like one. The honesty of that admission settled heavily in the space between them. Alexander considered her explanation, turning it over with the same scrutiny he applied to contracts and negotiations, yet finding none of the usual angles to exploit or dismiss. Instead, he found himself studying the way Ruth held the piece, how she angled it slightly, as if shielding it from even the possibility of being dropped. He stepped closer and extended his hand, not to take it away, but to support the bottom while she adjusted her grip, their hands never touching, yet moving in quiet coordination. He examined the repair from inches away, seeing how seamlessly it aligned with the original shape, how the crack no longer threatened the structure but remained visible enough to tell its story. He asked how long the repair would hold. Ruth answered that with proper care, it could last for years, maybe longer, if treated gently. The word gently lingered with him, foreign yet familiar. He nodded once, then asked her where she learned to fix things like this. Ruth told him about her earlier years, working in homes where memories mattered more than appearances, where repairing something broken was often the only way people held on to what they loved. She did not speak of hardship or loss directly, but it was present in every measured sentence. Alexander straightened, withdrawing his hand and stepping back just enough to see the mantle again in its entirety. He told her she should have informed him, not because she was wrong to care, but because some things required shared understanding. Ruth accepted that without argument, acknowledging the boundary while standing by her intention. The exchange ended not with punishment or dismissal, but with a quiet shift in balance, as Alexander realized that the conversation itself had altered something fundamental in the house, and perhaps in himself, leaving him with the unmistakable sense that the most significant confrontations were not always the loudest. The truth emerged not as a dramatic confession, but as something quieter, carried on Ruth Johnson's calm voice when Alexander Whitmore asked a single question that surprised even him, how she recognized the piece so well. Ruth hesitated only a moment before answering, not because she feared the response, but because the memory deserved care. She explained that years earlier, before this house and this job, she worked for an elderly woman who reminded her deeply of Eleanor Whitmore, not in appearance, but in spirit. The woman had been particular about the objects she kept close, handmade things that carried meaning far beyond their appearance, and Ruth had learned to notice the signs left behind by people who created with intention rather than perfection. She spoke of how some mothers pressed their thumbs too firmly into clay without realizing it, how they accepted uneven edges because life itself was uneven, and how they believed repairs were a form of respect, not failure. As she spoke, Alexander felt the words land with an accuracy that unsettled him. He had never described his mother that way to anyone, yet Ruth's description traced Eleanor with remarkable clarity. Ruth continued, explaining that when she saw the crack weeks earlier, she recognized the way the glaze fractured, not randomly, but along a natural line, the kind that appeared when a piece had been handled often and lovingly. She said she could almost picture the person who made it, standing at a table, adjusting it again and again, not to impress anyone, but because it mattered to her. Ruth admitted that she did not know the decoration belonged to Alexander's mother at first, but she felt certain it belonged to someone who would not want it abandoned to time. When she later learned whose it was, her resolve only strengthened. She believed that honoring a mother's work did not require permission when the alternative was watching it fall apart in silence. Alexander listened without interruption, the room receding as her words filled the space his own thoughts once occupied. He looked again at the repaired seam and saw it differently now, not as damage concealed, but as care revealed. The realization struck him with unexpected force, that Ruth had not repaired the decoration for him at all. She had repaired it for the woman who made it, for Eleanor Whitmore, whose presence still lingered in the house he thought he controlled. That understanding shifted something fundamental inside him. For years, he had guarded his mother's memory by keeping distance from it, believing that control equaled protection. Ruth had done the opposite, stepping closer, risking consequence, because she understood that preservation required action. Alexander felt his throat tighten, a rare sensation he quickly mastered, but not before it left its mark. He realized then that this was not about rules broken or boundaries crossed. It was about recognition, about one person seeing another not as a title or position, but as a human being worthy of care. Ruth lowered her gaze once more, believing she had said all that needed to be said, unaware that her words had reached a place Alexander Whitmore rarely allowed anyone to touch. In that quiet revelation, he understood that the most powerful gesture in the room was not his authority, but her respect, and that his mother's legacy had found its way back into his life through the hands of someone he had once barely noticed. The room held a stillness that felt heavier than sound, and Alexander Whitmore remained where he stood, his attention fixed on the decoration now resting securely in Ruth Johnson's hands. For a long moment, he did not speak, not because he lacked words, but because the ones forming inside him did not belong to the man he had trained himself to be. He felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, subtle yet insistent, as memories surfaced without his permission, small details he had buried beneath years of discipline and control. He remembered his mother humming softly while she worked, the way she paused to correct an imperfection no one else would notice, the patience she showed toward things that mattered only to her. Those memories had always existed at a distance, safely compartmentalized, but now they stood directly in front of him, embodied in a repaired seam and the quiet woman who had refused to let it fall apart. Alexander exhaled slowly, the breath grounding him as he faced the truth he could no longer ignore. He had believed that preserving his mother's memory meant freezing it in time, protecting it from touch, from risk, from change. Ruth's actions challenged that belief with a gentleness that disarmed him completely. She had not treated Eleanor Whitmore's work as a relic, but as something living, deserving care in the present, not just reverence for the past. Alexander felt the weight of that understanding settle deeply, reshaping something fundamental within him. He looked at Ruth again, truly looking this time, seeing not an employee defined by role or expectation, but a person guided by respect strong enough to outweigh fear. The power dynamic that usually defined every interaction in this house faded into irrelevance, replaced by a quiet equality rooted in shared recognition of what mattered. Ruth stood patiently, unaware of the shift she had caused, her posture composed, her expression calm, as if she had already accepted whatever outcome awaited her. Alexander realized then how rarely anyone in his world acted without calculation, without weighing benefit against cost, and how rare it was to witness sincerity unburdened by self-interest. The realization left him strangely exposed. He reached out and gently took the decoration from Ruth's hands, feeling its solid weight, its warmth from where she had held it. And for the first time since his mother's passing, he allowed himself to acknowledge the loss without armor. He did not rush to place it back on the mantel. Instead, he held it there between them, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been broken and what had been restored. His voice, when it finally came, was low and steady, but softer than it had ever been in this room. He thanked her, simply and without ceremony, the words carrying more meaning than any grand gesture ever could. Ruth nodded once, accepting the gratitude without surprise, as if she understood that this moment was not about recognition, but about connection. In that shared silence, Alexander Whitmore experienced a rare clarity, the understanding that strength was not diminished by care, and that dignity, once recognized, had the power to reshape even the most guarded heart. Alexander Whitmore placed the decoration back on the mantel himself, adjusting it with a care he had not shown anything in that room for years, stepping back only after ensuring it sat exactly where his mother once intended. The gesture was small, almost unnoticeable, yet it carried a quiet finality that Ruth Johnson recognized immediately. This moment was not ending with dismissal or discipline. It was moving forward. Alexander turned toward her and spoke again, his words deliberate, his tone no longer distant but resolved. He told her that some responsibilities could not be assigned or delegated, and that what she had done proved she understood the difference between maintaining a house and preserving a home. He informed her that from that day forward, her role would change, not in title meant to impress others, but in trust meant to endure. He asked her to take charge of the rooms his mother once favored, the personal spaces that had been left untouched out of caution rather than respect, and to tend to them with the same judgment she had shown with the decoration. Ruth listened carefully, absorbing the meaning beneath his words, understanding that this was not a promotion in the conventional sense, but a responsibility rooted in something far more personal. She accepted without hesitation, not because the task elevated her position, but because it aligned with the values that had guided her long before she entered this house. Alexander continued, explaining that he did not want those rooms preserved as memorials frozen in time, but cared for as living spaces that reflected the woman who once filled them with warmth and purpose. He trusted Ruth to decide what should remain, what should be repaired, and what should be let go, believing she possessed the discernment he himself had lacked. The decision surprised even him, yet it felt undeniably right. Ruth acknowledged the responsibility with quiet seriousness, assuring him that she would approach it with respect and honesty. There was no sense of triumph in her response, only commitment. Alexander watched her for a moment longer, seeing not just the competence she brought to her work, but the integrity that informed every choice she made. He realized that true authority did not come from issuing commands, but from recognizing when someone else was better suited to carry a certain weight. The house seemed to respond to that recognition, the tension that once defined its silence easing into something more breathable. As Ruth prepared to leave the room, Alexander stopped her with a final instruction, asking that if she ever believed something mattered enough to be saved, she should act, even if it meant questioning habit or expectation. The trust implicit in those words settled between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Ruth nodded, meeting his eyes with steady confidence, understanding that this exchange marked a quiet turning point. When she left the room, the house did not feel emptier, as it once had, but steadier, as if something essential had been returned to its proper place. And Alexander Whitmore stood alone before the mantel, aware that the most enduring forms of justice were often carried out without an audience, in decisions made quietly, guided by respect rather than power. The days that followed unfolded without ceremony, yet the house itself seemed to respond to the quiet changes set in motion that afternoon. Alexander Whitmore found himself passing through rooms he had avoided for years, noticing small shifts that spoke not of renovation, but of care. The light in his mother's sitting room felt warmer now, filtered through curtains that had been cleaned rather than replaced, the furniture arranged not to impress but to invite rest. Nothing valuable had been removed, nothing sentimental erased. Instead, everything felt considered, as if the space had been allowed to breathe again. Ruth Johnson moved through these rooms with the same calm purpose she brought to every task, never rushing, never drawing attention to herself, guided by an understanding that dignity did not require recognition to exist. Alexander observed these changes quietly, without interference, realizing that trust once given had altered his role entirely. He no longer felt the need to oversee every detail, because the intention behind the work mattered more than control. One afternoon, he paused before the mantel where the repaired decoration stood, unchanged since that day. It seemed visible if one knew where to look, honest and intact. He touched it lightly, not to test its strength, but to acknowledge what it represented. It was no longer a reminder of loss alone, but of continuity, of the fact that care could move forward without erasing what came before. Alexander understood then that his mother's influence had not vanished with her absence. It had waited patiently for recognition, carried forward by someone who understood its value instinctively. Ruth never spoke of the change in her responsibilities, nor did she treat them as a favor granted. She approached them as a continuation of who she had always been, someone who believed that what people left behind deserved respect, not neglect. In quiet moments, Alexander found himself reflecting on how easily power blinded those who held it, how often authority confused distance with strength. He had built an empire on precision and restraint, yet it was a simple act of care that recalibrated his understanding of what it meant to lead. The house no longer felt like a fortress guarding memories, but a place where memory and presence could coexist without fear. In recognizing Ruth's dignity, he had confronted his own humanity, long set aside in favor of survival and control. He realized that respect was not something he could demand, only something he could earn by allowing others to be fully seen. As the sun set behind the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor, Alexander stood alone for a moment, aware that no audience would ever witness this transformation, and that was precisely why it mattered. There would be no announcement, No acknowledgement beyond the quiet order restored within himself. The most enduring shifts rarely announced their arrival. They settled in silently, reshaping what followed. And that day, without spectacle or force, the world inside that house remembered what dignity looks like.